The Galactic Hegemony was an ancient and vast alliance, a coalition of over 100 species spanning thousands of systems. It prided itself on stability, order, and military supremacy. For over 10 millennia, no race had ever risen to challenge its dominion. Then, humans arrived. The hegemony initially dismissed them as a minor species from a backwater system, barely advanced enough for interstellar travel. Their physiology was unimpressive, weak, fragile, and biologically inefficient compared to the towering Dravak, the armored Kothiri, or the hyper-intelligent Korath. Even their weapons were outdated by galactic standards, relying on primitive kinetics and chemical explosives instead of elegant energy-based warfare. The Council of Races laughed and Earth's ambassadors first petitioned for entry into the hegemony. What could these soft-bodied primates offer us? They sneered. And when humanity did join, it was not as equals but as an afterthought, traitors, scavengers, and mercenaries relegated to the fringes of the galactic hierarchy. No one took them seriously. Then the Zalcor invaded. The Zalcor were a nightmare, vast insectoid war machines, their fleets darkening the skies of entire worlds. They did not negotiate. They did not take prisoners. They only consumed. Their hive fleets descended upon the outer hegemony colonies, overwhelming them in days, slaughtering millions, and leaving barren husks in their wake. The hegemony panicked. Their fleets, built for maintaining order rather than waging total war, crumbled before the Zalcor onslaught. Their commanders, accustomed to ceremonial conflicts and strategic posturing, were utterly unprepared for the brutal efficiency of an enemy that only understood annihilation. In desperation, the hegemony reached out to humanity, not for aid but for expendable bodies. Humans had proven themselves decent mercenaries in small skirmishes, so the Council reasoned they could serve as cannon fodder while the true warriors of the hegemony regrouped. Earth answered the call. But they did not send mercenaries. They sent war. The hegemony expected humanity to be crushed. When Earth's forces arrived at the embattled world of Roxas Prime, a critical border colony under siege, the Council dismissed their presence as a last-ditch act of desperation. The Zalcor had already torn through 2 hegemony battle groups. What could these primitive, war-inexperienced primates possibly achieve? Then the bombardment began. Unlike the hegemony, which relied on elegant energy-based weaponry and precision strikes, humanity fought differently. Their warships unleashed a relentless barrage of kinetic railgun rounds, hypersonic missiles, and tungsten rods that fell like the wrath of angry gods. The Zalcor, adapted to counter plasma and energy-based attacks, were unprepared for the sheer brutality of mass-driven destruction. But it wasn't just their weapons that shocked the galaxy. It was their tactics. While hegemony admirals fought with rigid formations and predictable maneuvers, humanity waged war like a cornered beast, vicious, adaptive, and utterly ruthless. Instead of engaging the Zalcor in open battle, human fleets split into rapid strike groups, hitting enemy supply lines and exploiting weaknesses with an almost malicious intelligence. And when the enemy reached the ground, the true horror began. On Roxas Prime's surface, hegemony forces had been fighting a losing battle, desperately holding the last defensive lines against the overwhelming Zalcor horde. They had all but accepted their fate. Then, the humans landed. Their soldiers, smaller, weaker, and outnumbered, should have been easy prey. But the Zalcor learned something that day. Humans did not fight for survival. They fought to kill. They used fire. Liquid fire that stuck to exoskeletons and burned through chitin. They used weapons that fired solid metal slugs, tearing through Zalcor warriors in brutal explosions of gore. And when their weapons failed, they used blades, fists, even their teeth, tearing into the enemy with an insanity that sent shivers down the spines of even the battle-hardened hegemony troops. The turning point came when a human commander, Colonel Adrian Vasquez, made a decision that would change the war. Seeing that the Zalcor hive tunnels ran deep beneath the city, she ordered a tactical nuclear strike underground, collapsing the entire network and killing millions of Zalcor in an instant. The hegemony was horrified. The humans called it Tuesday. By the time the smoke cleared, Roxas Prime had been saved. The first Zalcor invasion force had been annihilated. And the hegemony, for the first time in its ancient existence, realized that they had never truly known war. Humanity had arrived. And the galaxy would never be the same. The victory at Vroxus Prime sent shockwaves through the galaxy. For the first time in recorded history, the Zalcor had been stopped, utterly crushed, not by the might of the hegemony, but by the primitive, weak species they had once dismissed as an afterthought. And yet, it was not celebration that spread among the hegemony's high command. It was fear. Reports flooded in from surviving hegemony officers stationed on Vroxus Prime. They spoke of human soldiers who fought with an unnerving ferocity, who used weapons that burned and tore their enemies apart in ways that made even the Kathiri, one of the most feared warrior races, recoil in discomfort. There were whispered names now. The humans called Colonel Adrian Vasquez a hero. The hegemony called her something else. The Butcher of Vroxus. The title spread through the hegemony's networks like wildfire. Footage of the ground battles circulated across countless systems. One recording in particular horrified hegemony officials, Vasquez, standing over a pile of burning Zalcor corpses, her face streaked with soot and blood, snarling into the helmet feed, "If it bleeds, we can kill it. And we'll kill every last one." The council was divided. Some believed humanity was an asset, brutal, yes, but necessary. Others feared that in defeating the Zalcor, they had unleashed something far worse. But fear and debate did not stop the war. The Zalcor had taken notice. For millennia, the insectoid horrors had swept through the galaxy, devouring all in their path. No race had ever offered them a challenge. No species had ever forced them to retreat. Until now. To the Zalcor hive mind, war was a simple equation: an enemy was either food, or it was a threat. For the first time in their existence, they had found a threat. And they did not intend to let it live. Weeks after Vroxus Prime, humanity's colony on New Warsaw went dark. At first, the hegemony assumed it was a communications failure. Then came the distress call. A single, garbled transmission. Screaming. Gunfire. A voice choking through static. "They're not taking prisoners." Then silence. The Zalcor were done playing. The colony of New Warsaw was home to nearly 5 million people. It was one of humanity's most vital settlements outside the Sol system, a beacon of Earth's expansion into the stars. Bustling cities, orbital shipyards, and thriving industries had transformed it into a symbol of human resilience. Now, it was a graveyard. When the first human fleet arrived in response to the distress signal, they found a world in ruins. The cities had been razed, their towering structures reduced to molten slag. Corpses littered the streets, civilians who had tried to run, gunned down in droves. The orbital defenses, once formidable, had been reduced to drifting wreckage. But the worst was found in the underground bunkers. The Zalcor had not just killed. They had dissected. Thousands of bodies were pinned to walls, torn open with surgical precision. Entire sections of the colony had been turned into breeding pits, where human biomass was repurposed into grotesque new Zalcor organisms. The once proud citizens of New Warsaw had been transformed into raw material for the enemy's war machine. Admiral Jonathan Graves stood on the bridge of the H.S. Revenant, staring at the horror below. Around him, hardened officers sat in stunned silence. Some wept. Others clenched their fists, barely containing their rage. Graves did not weep. He did not rage. He simply gave the order. No survivors. Glass it. The human fleet descended upon New Warsaw, launching a bombardment of such fury that the very crust of the planet cracked. Orbital railguns fired kinetic slugs the size of buildings, turning Zalcor biostructures into craters of fire and ash. Plasma warheads detonated across the surface, sending shockwaves that collapsed tunnels and incinerated anything that moved. The hegemony watched in horror as an entire planet burned. To them, this was beyond war. It was annihilation. But for humanity, this was justice. And it was only the beginning. the destruction of New Warsaw had sent a message. To humanity, it was a blood-soaked promise: we will not be prey. To the Zalcor, it was a warning: you are no longer the apex predator. And to the hegemony? It was a nightmare. The Council of Races watched in growing unease as humanity unleashed its full military might. Before, they had seen humans as an anomaly, dangerous but controllable. Now, they understood the terrible truth: humanity did not simply fight wars. They ended them. ###The campaign begins. In the weeks following New Warsaw, Earth's war machine roared to life. Fleets of warships poured from shipyards across Seoul, armed with weapons that even the most advanced hegemony races had never dared to develop. AI-driven targeting systems, planet-cracking munitions, and chemical agents designed to dissolve Zalcor chitin at a molecular level. And unlike the hegemony, humanity did not fight for territory. They did not seek to push the Zalcor back. They sought extinction. The campaign began with Operation Scorched Earth. Human fleets swept across the Zalcor-controlled systems, obliterating hive worlds with a cold, methodical efficiency. They hit supply lines, obliterated breeding grounds, and eradicated every trace of Zalcor presence wherever it was found. If a planet was too infested, it was bombed from orbit until nothing remained but glass and fire. The hegemony recoiled in shock. Never had they seen a species fight with such ruthless intent. Even the most warlike races, like the Kothiri and the Dravak, fought with honor, with restraint. But humans? Humans saw honor as a luxury. Restraint as a weakness. To them, this was not a war. This was extermination. ###The hegemony's dilemma. Within the Hegemony Council, tensions erupted into chaos. Some factions saw humanity as their saviors, warriors willing to do what the hegemony never could. Others whispered that the humans were a greater threat than the Zalcor, that their unchecked aggression could one day turn against the very allies they had sworn to protect. But debates meant nothing when the Zalcor still threatened the galaxy. And the humans were winning. ###The Hive's response. For the first time in history, the Zalcor began to retreat. Their hive minds, once driven only by hunger, adapted. They recognized humanity as a threat beyond any they had ever encountered. Their genetic memory recorded the burning of New Warsaw, the annihilation of entire fleets, the way humans fought without mercy. And so the Zalcor changed. Their weapons evolved. Their tactics shifted. They abandoned direct assaults, instead launching ambushes, infecting hegemony worlds with biological plagues engineered from harvested human DNA, and sending suicide swarms to overwhelm human ships in sheer numbers. But humanity did not break. In response, they created the Black Protocol. A directive that ensured one simple truth: no human world would ever suffer New Warsaw's fate again. If a colony could not be defended, it would be denied to the enemy. Entire planets were rigged with self-destruct protocols, nuclear failsafes that would turn them into uninhabitable wastelands rather than let them fall into Zalcor hands. The rest of the galaxy watched in stunned silence. Even the most war-hardened species had never considered such an extreme doctrine. But to humanity, it was simply necessary. As Admiral Graves put it in a broadcast to the fleet: "If they want to burn our worlds, we will burn theirs first. If they want war without mercy, we will show them what that truly means. We are not here to win. We are here to end them." The war had reached its breaking point. Humanity's ruthless campaign had shattered the Zalcor war machine, burning through their empire with unrelenting fury. Dozens of their hive worlds lay in ruins, their supply chains severed, their fleets scattered like ashes in the wind. But the cost was steep. Entire human fleets had been lost in battle. Millions of soldiers had died. The hegemony was beginning to fracture under the sheer weight of the war, struggling to reconcile the horrifying efficiency of their new allies with the reality that humanity's methods worked. And then came the final, desperate gambit. ###The Zalcor's last stand. The Zalcor were not mindless. They were not simple beasts. Their hive intelligence, ancient and vast, understood that survival was no longer guaranteed. If they could not consume the galaxy, they would ensure their enemy burned with them. With what remained of their once endless swarms, they launched a doomsday assault on the hegemony capital world, Solera Prime Star. It was the heart of galactic civilization, home to the Council of Races, the seat of government, and the largest civilian population in the hegemony. If Solera Prime fell, the entire hegemony would collapse into chaos. The attack was unlike anything seen before. Instead of a conventional planetary assault, the Zalcor deployed world breakers, massive living bioships the size of moons, each carrying a super colony of trillions. They did not come to conquer. They came to consume everything. Hegemony forces scrambled to defend their homeworld, but they were not the ones who led the counterattack. It was humanity. #### The last debate. As the battle raged in orbit, the Hegemony Council convened in emergency session. A grim proposal had been placed on the table. The Black Protocol. If humanity could not hold Solera Prime, they would destroy it. The Council erupted into chaos. The idea of sacrificing their own capital, their home, was unthinkable. The Kothiri warlords raged. The Korath strategists objected, calling it madness. Even the battle-hardened Dravak hesitated. But Admiral Graves and Colonel Vasquez did not. They gave the Council a simple choice. Let humanity fight the way they needed to fight, or die. ### The counterattack. With the fate of the hegemony in their hands, humanity launched Operation Ragnarok. Every ship, every weapon, every ounce of human fury was thrown into the battle. The stars burned as human fleets executed a precision planetary defense, deploying kinetic kill missiles, nuclear warheads, and experimental gravitational weapons designed to rip apart the living bioships from the inside. On the ground, human forces reinforced the crumbling hegemony defenses, unleashing every brutal weapon they had developed throughout the war. Zalcor swarms were met with incendiary rounds, chemical gas, and railgun artillery that shattered them by the thousands. But it wasn't just firepower that won the battle. It was tactics. Where the hegemony fought with rigid formations, humanity adapted in real time. Small strike teams infiltrated enemy landing zones, using explosives to collapse entire sections of the city, burying the invaders alive. Cyber warfare specialists hacked into Zalcor biosignals, scrambling their hive coordination and forcing them to attack their own forces. And in orbit, Admiral Graves made the final, most ruthless move of the war. Using a stolen hegemony gravitational stabilizer, he dragged one of the Zalcor bioships into the planet's atmosphere, turning it into a fireball that crashed into the invading swarms below, obliterating billions in an instant. The war had always been brutal. But this? This was extermination. ### The turning point. The Zalcor, for the first time in their existence, broke. Their hive mind, unable to process the scale of their losses, collapsed into chaos. Without their central intelligence coordinating them, their forces turned into mindless, unorganized drones. And humanity hunted them down. Within hours, the last Zalcor fleet was destroyed. Their bioships were gutted, their swarms wiped from the streets of Solera Prime. The war was over. But the galaxy would never forget what it had taken to win. The war was over. The Zalcor, once an unstoppable force of annihilation, were gone. Their hive fleets shattered, their breeding worlds burned to ash, their genetic legacy erased from the stars. Humanity had done what no species had ever managed. They had not just won. They had exterminated an entire race. And now, the rest of the galaxy looked upon them with something far worse than admiration. They looked upon humanity with fear. ### The aftermath. Solera Prime was saved, but at a terrible cost. Cities lay in ruins, entire continents scarred from orbital bombardments, and millions of civilians lay dead. Though the hegemony still stood, it was forever changed. The Council convened once more, not to discuss rebuilding, but to decide what to do about humanity. The debates were bitter, frantic. Some saw humanity as saviors, the warriors who had done what the hegemony never could. Without them, the galaxy would have fallen. They argued that humanity should be rewarded, given a permanent seat in the hegemony's highest ranks. But others saw a different truth. Humanity had not just fought the Zalcor. They had become something else in the process. The methods humanity had used, planetary bombardment, mass sterilization, self-destructive scorched earth tactics, were beyond anything the hegemony had ever dared to contemplate. And they had done it without hesitation. Without remorse. If humanity was willing to wipe out an entire species, what would stop them from doing it again? #### the unspoken threat. The final, most chilling moment came when Admiral Graves and Colonel Vasquez stood before the council, listening to the accusations. They did not apologize. They did not ask for forgiveness. Instead, Graves simply leaned forward and asked a single question. If the Zalcor had won, would you have wanted us to show them mercy? Silence. Every species in the room knew the answer. Even those who feared humanity had to admit the truth. They had needed the humans to fight without restraint. They had needed the monsters humanity had become. And deep down, they knew something even worse. One day, they might need them again. #### the cold peace. In the end, the hegemony had no choice but to accept humanity into their ranks, not as equals, but as something far more terrifying. A necessary evil. The Butcher of Roxas. The Ghost of New Warsaw. The Monster of Solera Prime. The names given to humanity's leaders would live on in infamy, whispered in fear by generations to come. No one dared to oppose them now. No one dared to challenge Earth's rise. And as humanity's fleets expanded into the void, reforging the galaxy in their own image, the stars bore witness to a simple, undeniable truth. They had mocked Earth. They had laughed at its weakness. But now, they would never laugh again. Humanity had won. And the galaxy would never be the same.